Handmade Conversations. Today on the podcast, we have with us Mr. William Richardson. He is the founder and the managing director of Green Element, which is a company based out of London and Edinburgh in the UK. It is an environmental management consultancy, and we'll get to know a lot more from Will on what exactly it means to go green as a small business. So, Will, thank you so much for being on call with us. And I'd like to begin with just asking you, how exactly does Green Element function, and what exactly is environmental management consultancy?
No, thank you so much for having us on. It's really, really cool. I love what you guys do, and I think, yeah, it's such a great concept and great company. What does Green Element do? I guess, in reality, we help organisations become more sustainable, and it can be quite simple, where we monitor the energy usage or the environmental impact of an organisation, be it through their travel or procurements, and try and reduce that by looking at how they run as a business and what it is that they're doing. And this can work from really small organizations up to really big organizations. Everyone has wastage. And what's interesting is, just because you look at what you're doing in one year doesn't mean that you shouldn't look at it every year, because different people arrive, different things happen, and that wastage can just seep straight in again.
Right, that makes a lot of sense. All right, so when we talk about small businesses trying to go green, trying to switch to a sustainable approach towards their operations and their production, what do you think are key focus areas that they should focus on?
I think it depends on the organisation. I think I think the energy and buying renewables is probably the best and first thing that you can do as an organisation. And interestingly, it's not the first thing that most people do. Um, I don't really know why. Then look at how you're structured as a business and what is it that you're doing. So, say you are a office-based business that travels quite a lot. Do all of those meetings need to be taken? So, do you need to fly? Do you need to travel to those meetings? Could you not use technology to your advantage? I mean, for example, look at us. We're on two different sides of the world having a conversation
Right.
about sustainability, and it would have been ridiculous for one of us to have flown to each other's destination to have this call. But that does happen, and people do fly long distances to have an hour-long conversation. And then, if you're a more in sort of manufacturing and that kind of industry, then have a look at the way that your factory or manufacturing is set up. And we've all heard of TQM, Total Quality Management, and that way of thinking. And that is actually quite a sustainable way to review and run your business, because what you want to do is optimize the way that you are working as an organization, and making sure that product line has no wastage and has nothing coming out. So you could have a textile line making bags, and you have a load of cut off fabric. You want to get rid of that cut off fabric as much as you can. So therefore, how do you do that? Have a look at what it is that you're doing and how you're doing it, because the less cut off fabric that you have, the more environmental it is, because the more you're actually only using the fabric that you need.
Right, that does make a lot of sense. All right, so again, on the idea of trying to build an energy efficient, low carbon footprint, sustainable brand, how important do you think it is for small businesses to actually pivot to, say, going green versus having their own contemporary ways of producing or operating? So essentially, I guess the question here is, what's in it for them? How is it profitable for them?
Yeah, I think it does depend on the organization, and it also depends on where you're geographically based as well. So, what are the drivers around it? And I can really talk about the UK, because we're based in the UK, and I know that there are drivers. And I know one of the things that you'll be asking me about is tax benefits later on, but you've also got legislation that pushes organisations down a particular route. So in the UK, we've got something called the Climate Change Agreement, which is a way for high energy users, usually manufacturing and the like, to reduce their energy. So therefore, the more they reduce, the more they get off their energy. So they actually get a discounted energy rate. And the reason being is because the UK government understands that it does actually cost them quite a lot to run the country from an energy point of view, and they want to be able to try and reduce that impact. We actually do have a download ebook that I can send you that would be great to include in this podcast, and it's all about how to help SMEs to reduce their impact and what sort of barriers they have and how to overcome those barriers.
Oh, that's absolutely great. Definitely looking forward to reading that handbook. All right, so moving forward, when again, when we're making the switch, suppose I'm a small business, I'm making the switch towards going green. What are, say, the costs associated with making that switch in terms of, say, monthly revenue? And also, just like slightly to make this question a little bit more comprehensive, do you think that do the small businesses, would they need to renew certifications on a yearly basis? Would they need to submit to audits? And what kind of ROI, return on investment, can they look forward to?
It's a big question. I think it does depend on the industry. So some industries are very much tied into certifications like ISO 14001 or others because of the tendering process. So therefore, you would expect to see a company with ISO 14001. And when I say ISO 14001, it means that they have a formal environmental management system that is externally audited by a certification body. Therefore, that company has had their sustainable approach, their environmental impacts, looked at by an expert and someone externally, and that does cost. So therefore, we advise companies to go down that route if they feel they're going to be winning more work and they think that it's a good approach for the organization because within their tenders they're able to promote the fact that they have been externally audited, and that can help an awful lot of the supply chain. And the UK is quite big on ISO 14001. It is quite a big part of the supply chain. But then you could also use ISO 14001 and certifications for internal communications and impressing upon your colleagues and board members about how important sustainability is within your organization. You don't necessarily need to have the certifications themselves though, because if you can just run an environmental management system that's not externally audited but that has all the key elements of that system. So therefore your internal communications, your external communications, your reductions of your environmental impacts are still happening at all times. And going back to the ROI on all of this, it really depends on the business, and it depends on why you're doing it and what you're doing it for. So if you're a high energy user, then it's probably quite likely that it will have quite a quick ROI because you are going to be reducing that energy usage, and the time and effort that you put into reducing that energy will be paid off because of the reductions. If you are a very low energy user, then it may not. But then if you aren't going to win certain pieces of work, then actually the ROI is suddenly brought straight up because you're winning the work that you wouldn't necessarily win. So I think every case is, and every organization is slightly different, but you can quite quickly see whether it's worthwhile if you look at what the drivers are in place for you. So is it legislative drivers? Is it getting new clients? Is it because your colleagues want to work in a more environmental business, or is it because you want to run a sustainable business?
Right. That, yep, definitely that adds to our viewers' knowledge. So thank you for that. So, Will, you were talking about how the UK, the government, it does want to bring down the total energy consumption, especially by corporations. So, with regard to that, is there some kind of way that the government in the UK incentivizes businesses to adopt energy efficient and zero waste practices, in terms of, say, like tax benefits or some other motivation?
Yeah, I think, I mean, I'm going to be quite um, biased towards the UK government, I guess. But then I would be, wouldn't I? But I think we were the first country in the world to have a climate change act that came out about 10 years ago. And we were the first country to then come out with a net zero piece of legislation. So we said to the world that we'd be net zero by 2050. In some eyes, in many, and I'm also a part of those, I don't think that's quite good enough, although it was one of the most progressive things that a government has done around the world. And I think it's worrying that it's still not good enough
Right.
to be going down that route. But because of those drivers, and we've got a plethora of different pieces of legislation and energy savings opportunity schemes, streamlined energy carbon reporting, the climate change act, the carbon reduction commitments, the etc., etc. I could carry on chucking pieces of legislation that helps so many different businesses to reduce and to monitor and to understand. The most recent one being something called the streamlined energy carbon reporting legislation, and that any company over a certain size, and they don't have to be that big, like £30 million turnover, or 250 people roughly thereabouts working in the organization, have to report on their scope 1 and scope 2, i.e. any energy, any vehicles they own, and any electricity they buy. They have to report on those emissions, both as a carbon footprint and also the actual usage, and then put that into their financial reports, which are then put into the public domain. So that's, and we're starting to see even talks of going further than that, so starting to bring in scope 3. So will we start to see businesses having to report on their business travel, report on their commuting, report on their investments, etc.? And because we are starting to see organizations actually publicly reporting a lot of those anyway on their financial reports.